Hundreds of millions of people in urban areas across the world are already being affected by rising sea levels, increased precipitation, inland floods, more frequent and stronger cyclones and storms, and periods of more extreme heat and cold. Section 2 discusses the different ways in which cities are being affected by climate change, including effects on economic development, urban ecosystems, infrastructure, displacement, food and water security, social affairs and health. These effects are illustrated through 3 case studies: Paksay in Laos, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and Kampala in Uganda. The concept of vulnerability is introduced, in particular how the urban poor are the most vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. Climate change affects different aspects of cities, such as economic development and infrastructure. The effects depend on the location, characteristics, and adaptive capacity of cities. Ecosystems. Climate change impacts on ecosystems and the important services they provide, which include oxygen production and protection from flooding. Climate change will reduce biodiversity and wetland area and lead to loss of trees and soil, among other effects. Ecosystems are already often affected by human activities such as urbanization, deforestation, and the introduction of alien species. Poor and vulnerable communities are often relying the most on ecosystem services and are likely to be the most affected by the impacts of climate change. Economic development. Climate change will have many impacts on economic development. There will be effects on industry through damage to buildings, infrastructure, and other assets. Industry can also be impacted by effects of climate change on city infrastructure and transport networks, which can cause delays and increase costs. Climate change will also affect tourism in some countries through changing temperatures, disruptions to transport networks, and sea level rise in coastal areas, for instance in island countries. In addition, climate change will impact on the livelihoods of urban residents through, for example, affecting such means of production as social relationships or natural resources. Food and water security. Climate change will result in reduced food production in some countries through changes in precipitation patterns and temperature. Some areas will no longer be suitable for agriculture, and others will require irrigation for cultivation to be possible. Water resources will be impacted by factors such as increased demand and reduced groundwater recharge. Urbanization and growing populations will put more pressure on food production and water resources. More land will be needed for urban expansion, while at the same time, demand for food and water is likely to increase in those growing urban areas. Health. Climate change can affect human health negatively because it may alter the transmission of diseases such as malaria, cholera, and meningitis, meaning that these diseases will affect more people or different areas. Health is also affected by urban heat waves, which can result to hospitalizations and health-related mortality. More frequent and intense weather events such as storms or floods can also injure and kill people. In addition, climate change can lead to contaminated water supplies, which can increase prevalence of certain diseases. Infrastructure. Cities depend on different types of infrastructure such as power, water, waste removal and transportation infrastructure. Heavy rains, floods, droughts and landslides can damage roads, bridges and other transportation infrastructure. Water systems can be affected in various ways. For instance, saltwater intrusion can affect the quality of water supplies. Water supply infrastructure will also need to be able to cope with more frequent and intense storms or floods in some areas. Precipitation patterns can increase or decrease water supplies depending on location. Energy transmission infrastructure can be affected by storms and flooding. Homes and commercial buildings, especially in coastal areas, are vulnerable to flooding. Displacement. Climate change impacts may also lead to displacement of people and therefore increased internal and international migration. There is evidence of impacts such as flooding or drought leading to migration, for example in the Philippines and in Brazil. In addition to the human cost, displacement will put strain on the communities accommodating the displaced people, for instance in terms of competition for jobs and resources. Social. Climate change has social impacts. As will be discussed later in this module, climate change affects vulnerable groups more. It can exacerbate poverty and gender and racial inequalities. A vulnerability assessment helps policymakers to understand and prepare climate change vulnerability in their cities. There are different definitions of vulnerability to climate change. Here, it is referred to as being a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure refers to the degree to which a city is exposed to changes in climate, including projected future changes. Sensitivity is the degree to which people, places, institutions, and sectors are affected now and in the future by climate change. Finally, adaptive capacity refers to the degree to which people, places, institutions and sectors are able to adapt and become more resilient to climate change impacts. This video presents a climate change vulnerability assessment that was conducted by UN Habitat in the city of Paksay in Laos. Climate change intensifies the seasonal changes in the area, the dry season becoming much drier and the wet season becoming wetter, with more often and persistent floods. This has negative impacts on the town's activities, endangering the lives of its inhabitants.
การต่อสู้กับการเปลี่ยนแปลงของสภาพดินฟ้าอากาศถือว่าเป็นปัญหาของโลกหรือปัญหาของยุคสมัยในปัจจุบันเนาะหลายตัวเมืองสำหรับปากเซ่เฮาก็ถึงว่าเป็นเมืองบ่ใหญ่ปานใดก็มีผลกระทบเช่นเดียวกัน
The vulnerability assessment is a tool to identify exposure and sensitivity to climate change, to determine the adaptive capacity of the city and its inhabitants.
ในปีผ่านมานี่น้ำท่วมแต่ละปีน้ำต้องได้ท่วมบ้านเฮาบางปีก็ปีละ2 ครั้งก็มีน้ำหายแห้งขึ้นกว่าเก่า
Climate change is intensifying the seasonal changes and weather conditions in Paksay. We can see this with the wet seasons getting wetter, the dry seasons getting drier, and the rainy days becoming more intense.
น้ำท่วมนี่กระทันหันแล้วฝนตกแล้วน้ำกระแลนขึ้นแดนขึ้นเอายังน้ำกับบ่ทันเครื่องของอยู่กระด้างไหลไปเบิด
น้ำปีนี้หายแห้งท่วมแห้งหลาย ไปอยู่น้ำโมแหละน้ำเอื่อยน้ำนอง
จากผลกระทบภัยน้ำท่วมช่วงที่ผ่านมาเฮ็ดให้ปัญหาแรกๆก็คือสิ่งของก็คือธุรกิจของเราอยู่ทั้งหมดแมนอยู่ในเฮือนเนาะเป็นต้นแมนโรงน้ำแข็งซึ่งมันจะจุ่มน้ำซึ่งเราบ่สามารถที่จะผลิตน้ำแข็งได้ปัญหาสองคือโต๊ะกีฬาสนุกเกอร์ก็บ่สามารถดำเนินต่อไปได้เนื่องจากว่ามันจมอยู่ใต้น้ำ
ยุ่งยากหลายนั่นแหละมีเหือก็ยังยุ่งยากการกินการอยาก
ในน้ำท่วมในบริเวณนี่ช่วยกันแหละช่วยเอากันเอาไปช่วยกันเมียนขึ้นจำนวนพ่อเอาไปก็เอาไปจำนวนพ่อเมียนอยู่นี่ก็เมียนก็สามัคคีกันดีอยู่ตัวนี้ เจ้าช่วยคอยช่วยเจ้า
คือเขาเจ้าบ่ถึงน้ำท่วมเขาเจ้าก็ไปมาสะดวกแต่เฮาก็คือขี่เหือพวกเพื่อนที่อยู่ในน้ำนะถึงน้ำท่วมขี่เหือเฮาจังออกจากเฮือนได้
น้ำใส่น้ำกินกะยากเพราะว่าการทรงน้ำเขาก็ต้องยากมาส่งการเป็นอยู่ของเขาเจ้าแม่นยุ่งยากลำบากบ่ว่าจะการใส่ห้องน้ำการต้องใส่น้ำมาเฮ็ดหุงต้ม
แน่นอนถ้าว่าเขามีการปรับปรุงระบบการจัดการน้ำเกี่ยวกับน้ำเนาะการระบายน้ำจากตัวเมืองที่เป็นระบบครบสุดเนาะบ่ว่าคนบ่ว่าระบบวิธีการระบบเครื่องมือกาแน่นอนคิดว่าการลดผ่อนภัยพิบัติพ้นอันตรายได้
ซึ่งบ่อยากถ้าเป็นไปได้ก็บ่ต้องการให้อยากมีน้ำท่วมอีก
While climate change has an impact on both developed and developing country cities, often developing country cities are more vulnerable to climate change. The images give some reasons for different effects based on the categories of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure. Many of the world's cities are located in vulnerable areas, such as in low-lying coastal areas, which are much more exposed to the effects of climate change. The case study and the next slide will go into more detail. Sensitivity. The prevalence of unplanned urbanization in the form of slums and informal settlements and lack of adequate infrastructure are making developing country cities more vulnerable. Adaptive capacity. Developing country cities often have lower adaptive capacity, meaning that they do not have the same human, financial and other resources to adapt to the effects of the climate change as developed country cities generally do. Coastal urban areas will be particularly affected, especially those situated in low elevation zones. The rise in sea level will make them more vulnerable to inundation and flooding. Salt water will affect drinking water supplies and coastal erosion, and can reduce the land space. Damage to coastal cities also impacts on the levels of tourism. For instance, the coastal city of Mombasa in Kenya could lose around 17% of its land, which will affect amenities and features that draw in tourism. Coastal cities will also suffer more from the increased frequency, duration and intensity of storms. Many cities are located on coasts or near major rivers due to the advantages that these locations offered historically. The urban population in low elevation coastal areas is still growing. While climate change will affect everyone, there are particularly vulnerable groups. For example, the elderly and children suffer more from extreme heat waves, and women may be more affected by disasters. In addition, the types of economic activities that women often undertake, such as small-scale agriculture, are more difficult to compensate for than those of men. The urban poor are most affected by climate change. According to UN Habitat, around 30% of the urban population in developing regions was living in slums in 2012. The figure was over 60% in sub-Saharan Africa. These types of settlements are often built in areas that are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change because they are less expensive. In addition, houses and infrastructure are often poorly built, with little capacity to resist events such as flooding. Losing their house and possessions can have a devastating effect on the urban poor. They often do not have insurance, and such a loss can push them further into poverty.